When Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, there was no fire in her voice, no theatrics to grab attention, and no dramatics meant for viral clips. Instead, she spoke with a quiet precision that seemed to command the entire stage without her needing to raise her tone. The cameras caught her steady gaze as she carefully unfolded her words, and for the first time during the program, the room seemed to fall into a silence where every breath and shuffle could be heard. Viewers at home could feel the shift instantly. This wasn't a politician grandstanding. This wasn't a performer feeding an audience. This was a congresswoman who had come prepared, armed not with insults or bravado, but with carefully arranged facts. She began by laying out a timeline, almost like a teacher patiently walking students through a complicated lesson. Each date was connected to a decision, each decision connected to a consequence, and every consequence linked back to the man sitting just a few feet away from her. What made it so striking was not just the information itself, but the way it was delivered. Each sentence was measured, each word enunciated in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. Crockett didn't rush, and she didn't stumble. She let her statements breathe, almost daring anyone to interrupt her. And when they tried, she simply picked up where she left off without breaking rhythm. Donald Trump shifted in his seat as she continued. The familiar tactic of brushing aside, critics with a wave of the hand and a sharp dismissal, suddenly looked less effective against her calmness. He interrupted at one point, scoffing that what she was saying was totally fake and politically motivated nonsense. Normally, such interjections would be enough to throw an opponent off balance, but Crockett barely blinked. She waited, nodded slightly, and then repeated her point, word for word, as though she were reading it straight from a record. The repetition wasn't defiance, it was reinforcement. The effect was unnerving, because it stripped away the drama, and left the audience with one unavoidable truth. Her statements were not dependent on performance, they were dependent on fact. The audience sensed it too. The chatter that usually lingers in a studio during heated debates had died down. Eyes stayed locked on her, and the cameras caught every flicker of discomfort across Trump's face. Melania, sitting beside him, leaned ever so slightly forward, her expression unreadable but attentive, as if even she wasn't expecting the depth of detail being laid out before them. The room felt less like a televised discussion and more like a deposition, with Crockett acting as a meticulous examiner. What set the moment apart was how unshaken she remained in the face of interruptions. Trump's usual tactic relied on rattling his opponents, forcing them to match his energy or lose control of the conversation. But Crockett refused to play that game. She did not compete with his volume, nor did she try to outmatch his flair. Instead, she presented herself as the steady voice in the room, the one person unwilling to be thrown off balance no matter how forceful the put. That steadiness was more powerful than any outburst could have been. As she spoke, the weight of her delivery began to shift the dynamic. The spotlight, which had been shared between the former president and his wife, had moved entirely onto her. The cameras seemed to linger longer when she spoke, as if the producers themselves realized that the moment unfolding didn't need flashy edits or dramatic cuts. It needed silence, focus, and space to breathe. That was the essence of her control. She understood that the most shocking moments often come not from noise, but from calm certainty. Trump grew increasingly restless, visibly agitated as her narrative continued to unfold, but Crockett didn't speed up, didn't take shortcuts, and didn't offer him any gaps wide enough to wedge in a rebuttal. The deliberate nature of her pace made his reactions feel more like disruptions than counter-arguments. She made him seem as though he was struggling to catch up, while she stayed grounded in her prepared sequence. Every interruption, every visible sign of irritation, only highlighted the contrast between his restlessness and her composure. The true power of that moment was not in what was revealed, but in how it was revealed. Crockett embodied the idea that precision can be sharper than volume, that control can be more commanding than chaos, and that calmness under pressure can sometimes disarm even the loudest opponent. She showed that sometimes the most effective way to hold power accountable is not by raising your voice, but by refusing to lose it. The shift in the room became even more noticeable when Donald Trump began to show signs of frustration. At first it was small, a tightening of his jaw, a restless movement of his hands as he adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back in his chair. But as Jasmine Crockett's steady stream of details continued, the irritation became harder to mask. He was used to controlling the energy of the room, used to being the one who dictated the rhythm of exchanges. Yet here, his usual strategies seemed to fall flat, and the frustration bled through every gesture. He leaned into the microphone with a dismissive laugh, calling her statements garbage and nothing but a tired political hit job. Normally, that kind of retort would dominate the exchange, cutting through the noise and rallying his supporters with its sharp simplicity. But this time, it had the opposite effect. Crockett didn't flinch, didn't take the bait, and didn't respond. With anger, she simply let his interruption hang in the air, then calmly continued where she had left off, repeating the same dates, the same figures, and the same connections, without missing a beat. The crowd could see the contrast. His dismissal sounded hurried and defensive, while her persistence carried the weight of someone unshaken. Asterisk each time he attempted to shut her down. It only underscored how uncomfortable he had become. His voice rose, his hands gestured more wildly, and his body language betrayed a man who wanted desperately to take back control of the moment. Yet no matter how many times he interjected, the spotlight shifted right back to her once she spoke. Again, it wasn't just what she was saying. It was the refusal to be silenced that magnified his frustration. Viewers at home could see it clearly. The calmness of one figure made the defensiveness of the other look even sharper. Asterisk as the exchange continued. Trump leaned forward, shaking his head and smirking as if to downplay her words. He muttered phrases, like pathetic and so untrue, but the repetition of his denial seemed less convincing each time. The more he reacted, the more it appeared that her words had hit a nerve. The cameras caught every twitch, every impatient sigh, and every moment where his usual confidence faltered. It wasn't a shouting match. He was winning, it was a battle of composure. And in that arena, he was struggling. Asterisk at one point, he attempted to cut her off completely, raising his voice to drown her out. The audience, however, noticed the imbalance. Crockett, still unwavering, simply paused, looked directly at him, and then resumed her statement once the noise subsided. That pause was perhaps the most powerful part of the exchange. It was as though she had decided to let him exhaust himself, allowing the contrast between her quiet control and his escalating frustration to speak louder than anything she could have said. The pause exposed the weakness in his showed they were reactions, not rebuttals. Asterisk Melania sat beside him, silent, her eyes moving between the two. She offered no words to ease his irritation, no visible support in that moment. Her stillness made his visible restlessness even more pronounced. The audience could sense the tension not just between him and Crockett, but also in the unspoken silence of his wife. While he gestured and interrupted, she remained steady, her composed demeanor unintentionally reflecting the same calmness Crockett embodied. The contrast left him looking more isolated than before. Asterisk his frustration wasn't just personal, it was strategic. He understood the danger of allowing Crockett's words to go unchallenged, especially on live television where every second would be replayed, clipped, and analyzed. That urgency pushed him to respond faster, louder, and with more force than usual. But the more he did, the more defensive he appeared. Instead of discrediting her, his frustration validated her presence, turning the spotlight back to the very points he wanted to erase. Asterisk what made it worse was how obvious his discomfort had become. Trump had built a reputation on confidence, on being able to dismiss critics with a single line or a sharp retort that left them scrambling. Yet here, the repetition of his interruptions made him look cornered. His frustration didn't weaken her, it weakened him, stripping away the aura of control he normally carried. The audience wasn't watching a man in command. They were watching a man visibly unsettled, and it was that image that lingered long after the words themselves. Asterisk by the end of her remarks, his body language told the full story. Arms crossed tightly, eyes darting toward the cameras, his smirk had faded into a strained expression. Every effort to regain control had backfired, each dismissal making her appear more credible. His visible frustration had become the centerpiece of the moment, not the rebuttal he had hoped for. The audience didn't just hear his words, they saw his reaction, and that reaction revealed more than he ever intended. As the exchange unfolded on live television, one of the most noticeable elements wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. While Donald Trump grew increasingly agitated with Jasmine Crockett's steady delivery, Melania Trump sat beside him. In complete silence, she didn't lean toward the microphone, didn't interrupt, didn't even attempt to smooth over the tension with a polite smile. Her silence was its own kind of statement, and it added a layer of intrigue to the already charged moment. Asterisk cameras frequently cut to her, and the audience saw her expression remain neutral, almost unreadable, as Crockett laid out her points. At first, some might have expected her to nod in agreement with her husband's denials, to echo his dismissals, or to offer at least a visible sign of solidarity. But instead, she stayed still. Every time Trump interjected, scoffing at words, or raising his voice in frustration, Melania's reaction or lack of one was caught in the frame. The silence was not accidental. On live television, even the absence of words becomes powerful, and viewers began to wonder what that silence meant. Asterisk for Trump. The absence of visible support from his wife only seemed to magnify the unease of the moment. He spoke louder, gestured more aggressively, and made sharper interruptions, as though trying to fill the vacuum her silence created. When he dismissed Crockett's remarks as completely ridiculous, the lack of response from the woman sitting closest to him was noticeable. It wasn't that she contradicted him, she simply didn't echo him. That gap left his frustration hanging in the air without reinforcement. Asterisk Crockett, on the other hand, seemed to sense the impact of Melania's silence. Rather than directing her comments toward the loudest voice in the room, she allowed her words to reach the quietest one. By keeping her composure, Crockett created a contrast that drew attention not only to Trump's agitation, but also to his wife's refusal to engage. At moments when Trump leaned forward to dismiss her, Crockett's eyes didn't always meet his. They often shifted slightly toward Melania, as though to say, I don't need to convince him. I just need the truth to sit here, where it can't be ignored. Asterisk the audience at home picked up on it as well. Social media quickly lit up with commentary, not only about the tension between Trump and Crockett, but also about Melania's stillness. Some interpreted it as quiet disapproval, others as cautious neutrality. Regardless of the interpretation, her silence became part of the story. People weren't just talking about what Crockett had revealed, they were dissecting the way Melania chose not to publicly shield her husband from the weight of those words. Asterisk Trump himself seemed to notice. Each time the camera cut to her, his interruptions grew more animated, as though he was trying to draw her into the moment, to compel her to show some form of agreement or outward defense. But she didn't. She sat with her hands folded, occasionally glancing at him, occasionally at Crockett, but never stepping in. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't support either. It was a kind of detachment that only deepened the unease surrounding the exchange. Asterisk. That detachment fed into the overall perception of the moment. Trump's frustration was clear. Composure was undeniable, and Melania's silence provided the backdrop that made it all more striking. It was as if the stage had become divided into three roles: the calm deliverer of facts, the visibly irritated target of those facts, and the silent observer whose quiet presence magnified the tension. Without saying a word, Melania gave the audience something to speculate on. Something that added another layer of drama to an already tense encounter. Asterisk. The effect of her silence lingered beyond the broadcast. Viewers replayed clips, not just to analyze Crockett's words or Trump's interruptions, but to study Melania's reactions. Her facial expressions, or lack thereof, became a topic of conversation. People wondered if her silence was intentional, if it was an effort to stay above the fray, or if it was something more an unwillingness to publicly defend him at a moment when his frustration seemed to validate everything his opponent was saying. Asterisk for Trump, who thrives on loyalty and visible unity. The optics of that silence were difficult. He has always projected strength through the appearance of a unified front, and yet here, at a moment when he needed reinforcement most, he sat beside someone whose choice to say nothing spoke volumes. His irritation was no longer only directed at Crockett's words. It seemed to grow heavier with every second of silence that came from the person sitting next to him. Asterisk. By the time Crockett concluded her points, the contrast was etched into the minds of everyone watching. The calmness of her delivery had exposed his frustration, and the silence of his wife had deepened the weight of the moment. Together, those elements created an image that spoke as loudly as any words uttered on that stage. The atmosphere inside the studio had shifted dramatically by the time Jasmine Crockett finished laying out her points. What began as a routine broadcast had turned into a moment that felt almost suspended in time. The audience, both in the room and watching from home, found themselves hanging on to every word. Not because of theatrics, but because of the striking contrast that had unfolded before them. The calmness of Crockett's delivery, the steady unraveling of her statements, stood in sharp opposition to Donald Trump's escalating frustration. That contrast was what left the audience stunned. Asterisk. Trump had built his reputation on dominating moments like these. He was known for his ability to flip the energy of a room, to drown out critics with bold retorts, and to seize the spotlight with charisma and force. But on this stage, those tools weren't working. Every time he interrupted Crockett, her calm persistence absorbed the energy and turned it back against him. Instead of being rattled, she appeared steadier, more composed, almost as though his reactions were expected. The audience could see it happening in real time. The louder he became, the more credible she appeared. Asterisk for viewers at home. The visual split screen told its own story. On one side, Crockett sat poised, unshaken, speaking with the deliberate cadence of someone who knew her words would withstand scrutiny. On the other, Trump shifted restlessly, cutting in with denials, shaking his head, and gesturing with frustration. The split was jarring because it broke from the usual rhythm people expected. He was supposed to control the moment, yet instead, he looked like he was reacting to it. The more he tried to wrestle back control, the more obvious it became that he didn't have it. Asterisk. The live audience in the studio seemed to feel the weight of that dynamic too. When Crockett repeated her points after one of Trump's dismissals, there was a hush that fell over the room. It wasn't the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of people realizing they were witnessing something rare, a moment when control shifted in an unexpected direction. The fact that Melania remained silent beside him only amplified that tension, leaving Trump's frustration exposed without reinforcement. The energy in the room tilted toward Crockett, even though she wasn't raising her voice or pressing her advantage in a theatrical way. Asterisk. That tilt was not lost on Trump. He thrives on crowd reactions, on the sense that the room belongs to him. But here, the reactions were different. Instead of laughter or applause at his interruptions, the audience responded with uneasy stillness. Every attempt to dismiss her as fake or ridiculous seemed to fall flat in the face of her quiet certainty. For a man who had made a career of turning skepticism into applause, the absence of validation was striking. The more the audience withheld that response, the more isolated his frustration seemed. Crockett's composure turned into the defining feature of the exchange, and the audience's shock was rooted in how effectively it shifted the narrative. Viewers expected a clash, something explosive, but what they saw instead was one side unraveling and the other holding steady. That inversion of expectations made the moment unforgettable. Clips of the exchange quickly spread across social media, not just because of what was said, but because of how it looked. The calmness of one figure, the irritation of another, and the silence of a third created a triangle of tension that captured attention far beyond the immediate audience. Asterisk for Trump. The optics were particularly damaging. He has always relied on projecting control, on presenting himself as unshaken no matter the situation, but the audience didn't see that version of him in this exchange. They saw someone visibly unsettled, someone whose usual tactics weren't working, someone who couldn't bend the moment to his will. That image, more than any single word spoken, was what shocked people. It wasn't just that Crockett had dropped a bombshell, it was that the fallout played out in real time, and the reaction exposed vulnerabilities he rarely allowed to be seen. Asterisk as the segment came to a close. The stunned reaction of the audience lingered. People weren't rushing to applaud or shout, they were processing what they had just witnessed. The quietness of the room mirrored the quietness of Crockett's delivery. What had left them shocked wasn't noise or chaos, it was the realization that calm persistence had undone a figure who so often thrived on controlling the noise. For many, that realization would stick long after the cameras stopped rolling. Replayed again and again in headlines and clips, cementing the exchange as a moment where the usual balance of power looked different than anyone expected. As the cameras dimmed and the broadcast moved to a close, the weight of the exchange still hung in the air. What had unfolded was not the explosive back and forth that many anticipated, but something far more striking, a calm dismantling of a powerful figure's defenses in real time. Jasmine Crockett had not shouted, she had not gestured wildly, and she had not tried to compete with Donald Trump's volume. Instead, she relied on precision, composure, and persistence, qualities that proved to be more unsettling than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Asterisk for Trump. The evening was a reminder that not every stage can be controlled through force of personality. His visible frustration told its own story, one that played out just as loudly as Crockett's words. Each time he tried to dismiss her, his irritation only gave her points more weight. Each time he gestured or raised his voice, the calmness of her delivery made the contrast sharper. And through it all, the silence of Melania added an element of mystery. Her refusal to step in or echo his words left the audience with unanswered questions that carried just as much intrigue as the exchange itself. Asterisk the audience's reaction underscored the uniqueness of the moment. They weren't dazzled by theatrics or caught up in noise. They were stunned by the clarity of what they saw. It was the rare kind of live television where the dynamic shifted in a way no one could have scripted. Crockett emerged with credibility reinforced not by force but by discipline. Trump left with the image of a man visibly unsettled, his usual dominance slipping under the weight of composure he could not shake. Asterisk in the days that followed, clips of the segments spread widely. Commentators debated the meaning of silence, the effectiveness of Crockett's strategy, and the cracks in Trump's usually unshakable presence. Supporters and critics alike replayed the footage, searching for signs, gestures, or words that could explain the deeper meaning behind the moment. But what became clear was that the power of the exchange was not in hidden subtext, was in what everyone had seen plainly on their screens. Calmness versus agitation, precision versus deflection, composure versus frustration. Asterisk, it was a reminder that in the arena of public debate, strength does not always come from volume. Sometimes, the most powerful blow is delivered quietly, without theatrics, in a way that lingers because of how unshaken it appears. Crockett had shown that strategy, and the result was a moment that left a lasting mark on those who witnessed it. Asterisk for Trump. The broadcast would be remembered as one of those rare occasions when the stage did not bend to his will. For Crockett, it was a demonstration of how preparation and poise can cut through noise and leave an impression that outlasts the debate itself. And for the audience, it was proof that live television still has the power to surprise, to unsettle, and to reveal more about its participants than any